Awesome. Well, as Corey said, my name is Allison Varanelli. I'm a project manager at Collins Engineers, and we're the lead designer for the Cole Parkway Resilient Design and Engineering project. We have been working with not only Corey, but a couple other consulting firms, both with Whole Group and BSC Group. And I know we joined a select board meeting, I think it was almost a year ago now. But just kind of wanted to quickly give an overview. The purpose of this project is first and foremost a coastal resilience project. So, trying to address some of the flooding that we've seen at Cole Parkway, both from the harbor and then also that comes bubbling up through the catch basins. But in addition to that, we're looking to try to really enhance the site to make it more of a pedestrian-oriented, amenity for the town, as well as trying to enhance parking wherever we can, create more green space. So a lot of goals that we've been able to hopefully achieve with this project. So since the last meeting, I just wanted to recap kind of the main design progression that we've had with the project. So starting off, we opted to go for a lower design flood elevation, and what that term means is essentially that's the elevation that we're going to be protecting Cole Parkway from in terms of a coastal storm scenario. So there's different, water elevations that different storms have, and when we had first presented about a year ago at this project, we opted to go for a pretty significant storm scenario that was recommended by the state. But given some of the flanking concerns we saw at the site, which is relating to how low-lying Situate Harbor is, what we came to find out is essentially no matter how high we were to construct a wall, it really would only provide a certain level of protection because water would flow into Cole Parkway from the north, the west, the south, just given how low-lying some of the elevations are at those locations. And I'll get into that a little bit more on the next slide. But the second big change that we did, which isn't necessarily under this contract, but it is, an important part of this project, is that we are looking into expanding the footprint of Cole Parkway, our study area. So we're looking into the north, all the way up by the town pier, Mill Wharf Restaurant, Old Dock Street. We're looking down at the wetland just south of Scatuate Brook. So these are some of the primary problem areas that we saw water coming into our site through that we want to take a look at to see if, if we were to extend the flood protection structure around a larger portion of the harbor, could it provide additional benefit and could we provide more protection for the downtown district if we were to incorporate these other areas? So now that we've got these, different design flood elevations, we've gone and revised our conceptual alternative designs, which I'll share today. And then we also had a public engagement effort, which went really, really well. We were able to get a lot of great feedback from the local community, and we're really able to understand what their priorities were. So I wanted to talk about some of the coastal flood pathways, just because this is a key driving factor in terms of how the project has been progressing. So there's a lot of information on this slide. I'm going to hopefully simplify it for you, but originally we had proposed the design flood elevation, and remember that's what elevation we would be bringing this at the edge of the harbor up to provide protection against a storm scenario. So we were protecting against a 2070 100-year storm event. So this is a storm that statistically happens once every 100 years, and that takes into account the sea level rise that we would see in 2070. So what this black line is all around the perimeter of the site is essentially where our flood protection structure would go. So that's like the limit of where our site starts and ends. So you can tell that, we're really not touching anything further to the west or the north or the south. And what these red dots are essentially elevations all across the site. So keep in mind that Cole Parkway is shaped almost like a bowl. So we have low-lying points towards the middle of the parking lot in, this area, but as we look at other portions of the site, the boat ramp is only about elevation 6.9. Up near Old Dock Street, that's only about 6.5. So these are already low-lying areas. And, if we were to install our flood protection at elevation 12, it would be a pretty significant increase. But again, that would be ineffective as a standalone project. Some of the other elevations that you see surrounding our site that are outside of the limits, looking to the north, we have elevation 8.7 and 9.5. To the south, we have 9.2. These are areas where even if we were to raise this black line up to that elevation 12, and that's referencing a vertical datum, so it's not like a 12-foot high barrier that we would be putting in, but that's just the elevation of the barrier. So even if we were to raise that up, we would still have water coming into our site because this is only at elevation 9.2 and that's outside the footprint. So what we decided to do is we looked into lowering our design flood elevation. So essentially, we would accept a higher level of risk and only design to a lower storm scenario in order to, have more cost effectiveness and reduce the redundancy in our design. There's no point in raising it up to elevation 12 if water's going to flow into the site where these, blue arrows are showing, if it's going to blow or flow into the site when the elevations around the site are a lot lower than that. So by choosing elevation 9, that essentially matches the elevation of the seawall along the eastern side of the site, and it's basically bringing the rest of Cole Parkway up to match that elevation. And with that, we still have some coastal protection. We're still going to be resilient against a 10-year storm scenario that we'd see in 2030 or a 1-year storm event that we'd see in 2050, but it's just not going to be as robust of a design as what we had originally anticipated. And it's going to be, not nearly as significant in terms of cost. So I want to share what some of the proposed designs are, keeping this in mind. I'm going to show a couple of engineering plans, and then we've got some 3D renderings that we're going to show as well, which will hopefully give a little bit more perspective and be a little bit easier to understand. So I'm going to summarize some of the key improvements. This isn't everything, just given the time constraint, but some of the big picture items. So starting off, we're proposing to raise the parking lot up to about elevation 8.5 or so. Right now, Cole Parkway, it's at its lowest point, it's about elevation 6. Otherwise, it's usually around elevation 7. So it's not a ton of fill that we're bringing in, but it is enough to be able to allow us to raise up some of the catch basins and drainage infrastructure that we see at the site. And that will help with some of the backflow issues that we've seen with some of the coastal floodwaters coming through during those high tide scenarios that sort of bubbles up through the parking lot. So by raising the grade of the parking lot, we'll be able to combat some of those adverse effects. And this is, the raising of the parking lot, that's going to be consistent across all the alternatives that I'm going to show today. In addition to that, at the southern portion of the site, in purple, the purple lines represent all sidewalk improvements. You can see we've got some on the western side, the northern side, but on the southern side of the site, we're proposing to raise the parking or the sidewalk up to that elevation 9. So that will serve as coastal flood protection and also provide some flooding protection for the southern portion of the parking lot here. We're going to be resurfacing the boat ramp and grading that up to try to fix some of the pavement concerns that we've seen there. And on this alternative, we're actually expanding parking across the parking lot. So we've got a few additional spaces that we're proposing down at the southern end, a couple spaces at the northern portion of the site. So this is the only option that we're actually able to expand the parking scenario that we've been looking into. And then in addition to that, there's some other improvements, including drainage infrastructure improvements with these green rectangles that you see in the middle of the site. Those are essentially drainage swales, which are essentially twofold. They function, number one, as green space, so providing additional vegetation and grassed areas across the parking lot. But they also serve to capture and treat stormwater in terms of like a green infrastructure improvement, so that we're not just using structural best management practices to capture and treat stormwater. So that'll improve the water quality. We also have some solar canopies that we're proposing on the northern portion of the site to meet our green energy goals. And then along the western side of the site, and again, this is going to be an improvement that's consistent across all alternatives. Along the western side of the site, we're proposing to put in a flood wall along the sidewalk, which is essentially just a retaining wall that'll go there. And that will protect the buildings and the shops along Front Street from, some of the flooding that might end up coming into Cole Parkway during those larger storm scenarios. So now I'll show a rendering of what this will look like, which will hopefully be a little bit easier to understand. So again, this is a really familiar alternative. We're really just raising the site and making very minimal improvements in terms of changing configurations or green space. We do have the drainage swales here in the middle. You can see some of the potential solar canopy locations. We've got the western flood wall and then the expanded sidewalk along the southern portion of the site. So that's alternative one. Alternative two, we separated into 2A and 2B because they're very similar. There's just kind of the main changes are in terms of the green space improvements that we're making. So on the first, or 2A, we're going to keep the same exact improvements that we had on the last alternative in terms of the southern portion of the site. So still have the raised walkway, still resurfacing the boat ramp. We're still going to be raising the grade of Cole Parkway up to about elevation 8.5, which again allows us to incorporate those raised catch basins and stop that adverse reaction happening from the floodwaters coming up through the catch basins. But on this option, the biggest improvement that you'll see is this centralized walkway that we have, which again, this serves not only as a pedestrian improvement, it provides, green space, so vegetation, but it also is another drainage infrastructure improvement where it can capture and treat stormwater. So again, meeting those improved water quality um, requirements and having just additional more green space at Cole Parkway. On here, we've also got some parking islands that we're proposing to put in. These are just additional grassed areas to try to separate some of the expanse of pavement. And again, incorporating those flood walls on the western side of the site, some sidewalk improvements. So some similarities, but again, that centralized walkway is really the key
Yeah.
difference on this option. So again, what that might look like is maintaining the same configuration down at the southern portion of the site. We've got our resurfaced boat ramp, but this is where we have, some raised crosswalks that'll connect to this pedestrian walkway that goes right down the center of the site. And, this is a really great option because it provides direct access from the shops and restaurants along Front Street directly to the harbor. So just another avenue for people to kind of provide that pedestrian amenity at the site. So 2B is going to maintain roughly the same parking configuration as 2A in the central portion of the site. However, the big change is down at the southern end where we're proposing to essentially reconfigure the Front Street entrance. So, kind of pulling this entrance a little bit further in. We're removing some of the parking down here, but still incorporating some parking as angled spaces here, but we're able to include this enhanced green space. It's expanded green space. We've got a restored wetland. There's a boardwalk that comes all the way through the site here. So a lot of really nice pedestrian amenities at this location. On this option, we're also proposing to extend the boat ramp and resurface it. So this will provide additional access for recreational boaters, for trailered vessels. Right now, the boat ramp's in a little bit of rough shape. It doesn't go all the way down to mean low water, so it's the use of it is really restricted by the tides. But under this option, we're able to provide access during all tidal scenarios, which will be, a benefit to recreational boaters. So again, on this option, we're still raising the site. We're still going to incorporate those catch basin improvements and still have the flood wall protection all along the western side of the site here. So again, this is similar to the last option. We don't have any solar canopies on this option, but you can see where we have that boardwalk that comes all the way around the southern perimeter of the site and really provides a lot of great green space improvements, great wetland vegetation, and a really nice pedestrian experience down at the southern end of the site. So another thing that I wanted to touch on that was, kind of a key driving factor that we took into consideration as we started developing these alternatives is the public feedback that we received from the local community. So we had a public engagement effort and it was essentially threefold. We had an online survey which provided a lot of really great information where we were able to ask people questions about their preferences for certain design elements. And that, we had about 300 respondents on that, so a lot of great feedback that we were able to receive from that. And then we also had a public meeting back in July, and we had a great turnout at that. Probably 50 people came or so. And we had poster boards available during that meeting as well that people could fill out their preferences for different design elements that we had talked about and presented during the meeting. So I do want to present just briefly on some of the feedback that we received from the survey, just because that provided a lot of really good quantitative metrics that we could use as we develop these alternatives. So, we asked the people questions like, what site features would you like to see in Cole Parkway? And listed a whole bunch of different options. And through that, we were able to identify a couple of different priority design features. And, more green space and shade and the better connected harbor walk came out as kind of the key top priorities that were identified by the community. And, as I had presented the alternatives on 2A and 2B, which had, the pedestrian walkway through the middle of the site and then the green space and boardwalk improvements at the southern end of the site on 2A and 2B respectively, those two options really tried to take into consideration these priority features that were mentioned during the survey that we got the information on. So those two alternatives really emphasize the priority design features, whereas when we also asked people what their top concern areas for the site were, we found out that flooding and limited parking were, kind of the main problem areas that the community has been able to see at Cole Parkway. So all three alternatives that I presented are going to see an improvement in the coastal flooding and in the catch basin flooding. So that's been addressed on all three. But the limited parking, because we're so limited in space in Cole Parkway, we did want to provide at least one alternative that provided improved parking, which was that first option that I shared, where we have a net increase in parking. But the other two, there is going to be a net decrease in parking. But that's essentially how we tried to take this feedback from the community and tie it into our alternatives. And then the last slide that I have to share today, this is sort of where we're at now with the project. And this is a bit of a work in progress, but what we're working on is establishing an alternatives analysis. And what we do is we come up with this matrix that really ranks the alternatives against each other, and provides some quantitative measures that we can assign to each option in terms of different criteria. So we take a look at the alternatives in terms of some of the most important things to consider when we want to select one for our preferred alternative to continue the design with. So we look at them in terms of things like cost, what the impact on the parking spaces are going to be, permitting and maintenance, as well as the community priorities like added green space and the pedestrian experience. So, looking at a matrix like this, you can see that something like alternative one tends to rank higher in terms of having a cheaper cost, and having a better impact on parking since we're going to be improving the parking. But it doesn't meet the pedestrian experience and the green space vegetation requirements that we wanted to meet, nearly as much as something like alternative 2A or 2B does. So, looking at on the other end of the spectrum, 2B is, yes, it's the most expensive and it does have the most impact on reducing the parking at Cole Parkway. It also has a lot of really great benefits in terms of adding green space and vegetation, and improving the pedestrian experience. So this is kind of where we're at right now on the project. We're working currently with our subconsultants on developing a much more robust alternative ranking system that we'll be providing to the town. And we're going to have another public engagement session where we're going to share these alternatives and these renderings to the community and, show them how we've been able to incorporate their feedback in these options. But that's kind of where the project stands right now.